Hi, I'm Dan Costa, Chief Content Officer at Worth Media Group, and I am here at the Milken Global Conference. I am joined at the moment by Shamina Singh. She is the Executive Vice President of Sustainability at Mastcard. Shamina, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you are also the President of the Mastcard Center for Inclusive Growth. And I think it would be useful to and that's one of the big themes of Milken as well. Maybe we could how do you see inclusive growth? How does Mastcard see it? And then how are you taking advantage of the massive data resources that Mastcard has to further that type of goal?
Well, thanks again for having me. And I think it's a great way to start the conversation here at Milken, because we really started the Center for Inclusive Growth over 10 years ago because we recognized at Mastcard that the world was moving from analog to digital. So for us, that meant financial inclusion and making sure that we were helping people move into the digital economy. Now we've seen the world start to shift from the digital economy to a data-driven economy, but technology has been the undergird of all of that. So at the center, when we think about inclusive growth, we focus a little bit more now in this environment on the growth side of things, but the idea here is to ensure that everyone benefits from a growing economy. And so that means people who are often underestimated or overlooked, whether they're in the United States, in Appalachia, and more rural counties and areas. It also means people who are marginalized and maybe overlooked in markets like Africa or Latin America or Asia. But the point is that in order for true economic growth to be achieved, we want to make sure that it is sustainable and inclusive of everyone everywhere.
So we're at a conference right now. You just had a conference that also contained a lot of these themes. Maybe tell us a little bit about how that went, what the themes were, and how it compares to what you've seen so far at Milken.
Sure. So we host every year the Mastcard Center for Inclusive Growth's Global Inclusive Growth Summit. We finished ours 2 weeks ago. We do it on the sidelines of the World Bank spring meetings. And we really use it as an opportunity to bring our partners together from around the world with our partners that we need to ensure that growth happens inclusively. So as an example, we bring in private sector leaders, public sector leaders, social sector leaders across data, AI, from all sectors, from all industries, to have conversation that focuses on action. And so I have been here for half a day so far, and I see a lot of similarities, but I also see a lot of differences. And I think the big difference with our Inclusive Growth Summit is that it's almost a conversation among friends. It's about people who are passionate about growth that is inclusive, but they're also practitioners. And so they use it as an opportunity to exchange ideas and formulate partnerships that come out of that. I think here this is fantastic and fascinating, and what I'm finding is I'm seeing people here who I don't know necessarily. I may have heard of them, or they may be operating in private equity or more around financial services. And I think that is a distinguishing factor about this conference, is that it's much more focused on investment. And so I think the two things are very complementary, and I'm very glad to be here.
There's also, it seems the interesting thing about both of them, though, is that they do have a global approach, and there's so many ways we are not looking at the world globally anymore, or not all of us. But I think that offers some real opportunities in terms of not only the capital that's out there and how it's being allocated, but also raising the playing field for everyone. So maybe talk a little bit about how your international efforts have been.
Sure, and it's interesting because we always see the dynamism is the shared factor. And so as an example, what we're seeing in Asia is that they really represent a really interesting, dynamic, growing middle class. And so we see, over the last 10 years, we've seen 1 billion people join the digital economy. Over the next 10 years, we're going to see 1 billion more people joining the middle class. Many of those people are actually going to be in Asia. And it's interesting because, of course, in the United States, in Europe and things like that, when we think about middle class, we may be thinking about, a 2-car family, a nice house in the suburbs and things like that. When we think about the middle class in Asia and the emerging middle class, these are people who are going from $4 a day to $12 a day. So it's a different concept of what middle class movement looks like.
Just as transformative and maybe even more so.
100%, because what it's about is purchasing power. So it takes more income to purchase the same amount of things maybe in the United States than it would maybe in Asia right now. So what's really interesting is looking at purchasing power and consumption measures. But what's also interesting and really important is to think about the moment of inclusive growth in that. And so that's where Mastercard, I think, really has an interesting role to play because of our proximity to data, of AI, of security. So as we think about leveraging assets for impact, which is kind of what the center does, as a matter of course, we think about looking at different demographics and different populations and ensuring that we're using our assets in the best ways possible.
So you're going to be on a panel in a couple of days about the American dream and achieving the American dream, what that means today. It couldn't be more relevant, I think, on all ends of the spectrum. Can you talk a little bit about, what's that conversation going to be like? Who's going to be a part of it? And, what do you think is going to come out of it?
It's also a great question, and I think it's interesting because, of course, Michael Milken himself has invested a tremendous amount of capital into a new center for the American dream in Washington, D.C. So I think, look, I personally, as the daughter of immigrants, I was the first daughter born in the United States to my parents. The idea of the American dream is something that is very proximate and very tangible. For me, and what I'll share on the panel is that, a rite of passage for us in my household, I have 4 sisters, was voting. So when we turned 18, I think a lot of my friends growing up in Southern Virginia, I was in a small town in Southern Virginia, they'd think about their 18th birthday as, maybe a big party or maybe a big, celebration of some sort. For me and for our family, it was going with my parents to the fire station and voting for the first time. That's when they said to us, you belong to this country, you belong to this community, and democracy is what matters. And so this real notion of preserving democracy, participating in democracy, participating in the economy, in the way that was unique to my family and the values that we bring, but also the characteristics that we bring. But the notion was we all have something to bring and something to add. And my mother's house, when I was growing up in Chesapeake, Virginia, was nicknamed the Global Village because my parents...
You got ahead of that.
Yes.
Hopefully you trademarked it and registered the URL.
Not yet, but because my parents were very much about making sure that everyone felt welcome, not only in our home, but in our community. And so for them and for me, this country and the values is about ensuring that people have the opportunity to succeed. And so from a very young age, obviously, my mother and my father, by creating our house as a global village, by the way, it was a very small house in a small neighborhood, so make no mistake, my father was a community college professor and my mother was a small business owner. We had very good conversations there that reflected the globality of our world, but very much had the practical application of being in a small town in Virginia.
Yeah, it reminds me that the American dream was never just for Americans. It's for the rest of the world, and it always has been. So that I think we sort of lose track of that and think that calling it the American dream means there's some possession of it, but the dream is not limited to citizens and never has been.
Well, what's interesting to me is that from again, when I was growing up, the American dream is about what you're saying is also about Americans, and they define it. So however you define being an American, and for me, I define it as being, the daughter of immigrants and my family's history and my trajectory in this country and the trajectory that we have on creating for everybody. But the definition, it's not monolithic. And so that's what I've found, again, growing up is that, my friends today from elementary school and junior high school and high school, we have very different views sometimes on politics. But our shared perspective is we want the best for our community. We want the best for our children. We want the best for our families. Sometimes our ways of getting there might be different, but our shared experience.
And we want the best for our neighbors.
And
even
we
if
want
we
the
don't
best for our
agree.
neighbors. Yeah. And so, when you're in community and you're actually speaking with one another, I think that's a really important factor. And so I grew up in a town where we did talk to each other and we disagreed, but we went to the football game, on Friday nights together, or we agreed and we still did our senior class plays together. And so I think it's about the relationship. And for me, that is at the core of America and being an American, is the relationships that we form are based on a shared belief that families matter, that communities matter, that neighbors matter. But the politics around that or the beliefs around that may be different. It's not a reason to diverge, it's our reason to converge.
Amen to that. I know you've got a lot going on this week. Thank you so much for taking a couple of minutes and talking to us.
Really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's it for now. We're going to have more videos like this on youtube.com. I will see you there.